Human beings are the only creatures that can look into the eyes of another and choose to make them suffer. No other animal kills for the thrill of domination, humiliates for the taste of superiority, or destroys for the pleasure of watching something break. That is our most chilling achievement, that we turn pain into art. The story of human cruelty is not a deviation from our nature. It is our nature, refined through consciousness, sharpened by imagination, and sanctified by justification. Cruelty was not born in darkness. It was born in the light, in the dawn of self-awareness. The moment we realized we were different from the beasts, we also discovered we could become far worse. When early humans first saw their reflection in still water, they saw not just a face, but power, the power to hurt, to control, to decide who lives and who kneels. Nature taught us survival, but consciousness taught us domination. We became not just predators of flesh, but predators of spirit. Think of it. Somewhere in prehistory, before cities, before gods, before laws, a man struck another, not for food, not for defense, but for control. And in that strike, something irreversible happened. He felt it. The rush. The momentary transcendence of fear through the submission of another. For the first time, survival wasn't enough. He wanted power. And power, at its most primitive root, is the ability to inflict suffering without consequence. This is the secret few dare to acknowledge. Cruelty did not evolve despite our intelligence, it evolved because of it. Only a mind capable of empathy can choose to suppress it. Only a being that understands pain can weaponize it. The lion kills instinctively, but the human kills with imagination. We learn to prolong pain, to savor the reaction, to turn suffering into spectacle. From the arenas of Rome to the psychological torment of modern life, we've carried that ancient thrill forward, repackaged, rationalized, disguised, but never extinguished. But why? Why do we hurt when we could help, dominate when we could cooperate, destroy when we could create? The answer lies in the fragile architecture of our identity. Deep down, every human being carries a quiet, unbearable truth, that we are powerless against death. We cannot stop decay. We cannot outlive time. Cruelty is our rebellion against that truth. When we hurt another, we feel, for a fleeting instant, immortal. The pain we inflict becomes proof of our existence, a declaration that we matter enough to change the world around us, even if that change is through destruction. Psychologists have long recognized this pattern. Eric Fromm called it the necrophilous orientation, the love of control, of turning life into object. When people lose connection to vitality, they turn toward domination to feel alive. Cruelty, then, is not always hatred. It is often the desperate act of the spiritually numb. The sadist and the tyrant are not merely evil, they are empty. They hurt to feel. Nietzsche saw this clearly when he wrote of the will to power. He argued that beneath all human behavior, love, creativity, even kindness, lies the drive to assert one's strength against resistance. Cruelty is power stripped of its mask. It is the raw, unfiltered expression of that will, power for its own sake. The weak, he said, disguise their desire to dominate under the language of morality. But the truth remains. Every human being carries within them the instinct to rule or be ruled. We repress it, we moralize it, but it never disappears. And perhaps that's why cruelty endures even in civilized society. We've outlawed violence, but we've replaced it with humiliation. We've abolished public executions, but we've turned social media into a digital coliseum. We destroy reputations instead of bodies. We cancel, ridicule, ostracize. It's the same ancient instinct, dressed in moral language, justified by collective approval. We still crave the spectacle of another's downfall, because when someone else is beneath us, we momentarily escape the unbearable awareness of our own fragility. But cruelty is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it's subtle, a smirk at another's failure, a deliberate silence, a withheld compliment. Everyday cruelty thrives in the polite gestures of indifference. It doesn't need blood to feed, it feeds on shame. Modern cruelty hides behind civility, professionalism, and humor. We call it honesty, tough love, or realism. But underneath, it's the same primitive delight, the joy of reminding someone that we have the power to hurt. Have you ever noticed how easily children can be cruel before they learn empathy? A child plucks the wings off an insect, mocks a weaker friend, tests the boundaries of dominance. That's not learned behavior, it's instinct, raw and untamed. What civilization does is not erase cruelty, but teach us to conceal it. The difference between the barbarian and the civilized person is not the absence of cruelty, but the sophistication of its disguise. Jung warned that when we repress the the dark, primal aspects of ourselves. It doesn't vanish, it festers. The cruelty we deny in ourselves, we project onto others. We demonize, we otherize, we dehumanize. It's easier to label someone else evil than to admit that the same potential lives in our own blood. And yet, paradoxically, that denial is what allows true cruelty to flourish. The greatest atrocities in history were not committed by monsters who knew themselves as cruel, but by ordinary people convinced they were righteous. This is the unbearable paradox of the human mind. Cruelty often masquerades as virtue. The inquisitor tortures for faith. The soldier kills for peace. The parent shames for love. The mob humiliates for justice. We rarely see ourselves as cruel, we see ourselves as correct. And that illusion, that moral disguise, is what makes cruelty endless. Because no one believes they are the villain. When we inflict pain, we are not only expressing dominance, we are telling ourselves a story. We are saying, they deserve it. And that story gives cruelty its most enduring power, moral legitimacy. Once pain is justified, it becomes sacred. The executioner becomes a hero, the persecutor becomes a savior. History is filled with the corpses of people who died for someone else's conviction that cruelty was necessary. But here's the truth we rarely face. Cruelty doesn't reveal strength. It reveals fear, fear of insignificance, fear of weakness, fear of the mirror. Because cruelty is always projection. The tyrant punishes in others what he despises in himself. The bully humiliates the reflection of his own insecurity. The nation wages war against the shadow it refuses to face within. Cruelty, in its deepest sense, is not about others. It's about our inability to sit with our own darkness without trying to destroy it. And yet, buried beneath that horror lies something worth noticing, the seed of potential transformation. If cruelty is born from fear and separation, then to understand it is to begin healing it. To look at cruelty without turning away is to reclaim the empathy we've buried. The same awareness that made cruelty possible, our consciousness, can also redeem it. Because once you see what you're capable of, you can choose differently. That is where this story turns next. Because the evolution of cruelty is not just a tale of darkness, it's also the mirror of our awakening. For every act of destruction, there has been an answer of compassion. For every wound inflicted, there has been a human being who refused to perpetuate the cycle. The question is not whether cruelty exists, it always will. The question is whether we are brave enough to face the part of ourselves that takes pleasure in it. So stay with this thought as we continue, because in part 2, we will descend deeper into the psychology of cruelty, how societies normalize it, how ordinary people become its instruments, and how even you, yes, you might unconsciously participate in it without realizing it. Cruelty does not begin with monsters. It begins with ordinary people, with you, with me, with anyone who's ever looked away. The most terrifying thing about cruelty is not its extremity, but its normality. It hides in systems, in obedience, in the quiet shrug of that's just how things are. No one wakes up one morning deciding to become cruel. Cruelty creeps in through the language of duty, order, and belonging. And before you know it, people who once thought themselves incapable of harm are carrying out acts that make the soul recoil. Psychologists like Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo exposed this truth in chilling experiments. In Milgram's obedience study, ordinary individuals, not sadists, not soldiers, just regular citizens, were told to administer electric shocks to strangers as part of a learning experiment. As the supposed victims screamed in pain, the participants hesitated, but when told by an authority figure to continue, most obeyed. They pressed the button again and again, even when they believed they were killing someone. When the study ended, the participants were horrified by what they had done, but even more horrified by how easily they'd done it. What these studies revealed was not new. Philosophers like Hannah Arendt had already seen it during the Nuremberg trials. She called it the banality of evil, the terrifying idea that most cruelty is not committed by psychopaths, but by normal people following orders, performing roles, seeking acceptance. Evil does not always wear a monstrous face. It often wears a uniform, a smile, or a job title. It thrives not on rage, but on compliance. Cruelty, at its core, is systemic before it is personal. Societies build mechanisms to make harm feel necessary, even noble. They redefine violence as virtue. The soldier doesn't see himself as a murderer, he sees himself as a protector. The interrogator believes he's serving truth. The corporate executive who exploits thousands tells himself he's creating jobs. Cruelty is not sustained by hatred, but by narrative. Once you give harm a reason, it becomes sacred. And this is how civilization evolves its most efficient cruelty, by moralizing it. Ancient Rome called it justice, medieval Europe called it faith, modern society calls it progress. Every age invents a language to cleanse its conscience. But underneath the rhetoric, the pattern remains the same. The powerful inflict suffering, the powerless endure it, and both believe it's justified. Consider how cruelty adapts to culture. When physical violence becomes taboo, psychological violence takes its place. We no longer enslave bodies. We enslave attention, manipulate emotion, monetize insecurity. The lash becomes the algorithm. The arena becomes the feed. We destroy reputations instead of flesh, isolate instead of execute, shame instead of slay. Modern cruelty is subtler, but not softer. It still feeds on the same hunger, to dominate, to control, to prove one's existence through another's degradation. But why do we obey systems that perpetuate cruelty? Because cruelty offers belonging. The moment you participate in a collective act of harm, you are no longer alone in your darkness. The mob, the army, the corporation, these are sanctuaries for the conscience. When everyone is complicit, no one feels responsible. Shared guilt becomes shared absolution. That's the genius of cruelty. It turns sin into solidarity. Zimbardo's prison experiment revealed this perfectly. Volunteers assigned as guards began to abuse the prisoners within days, not because they were told to, but because the structure itself allowed it. The uniform, the authority, the expectation, all combined to dissolve empathy. Cruelty, given permission, multiplies. It doesn't require hatred, only distance. Once the victim is dehumanized, reduced to an object, a label, a number, compassion collapses. That's why every act of large-scale cruelty begins with language. Words are the architects of inhumanity. Before anyone is enslaved, they are called less than. Before anyone is killed, they are called other. Before anyone is humiliated, they are called deserving. Words build the moral scaffolding that allows cruelty to climb. That is why tyrannies invest so heavily in propaganda, because cruelty needs a story to stand on. And yet, cruelty does not always come from the strong. Sometimes, it's the powerless who become cruel, those who have suffered humiliation and wish to reverse the roles. Victims can become executioners when given the chance. This is not hypocrisy, it is the logic of pain. The oppressed, having learned the language of cruelty, often use it when they finally gain power. History repeats because trauma seeks expression. The child who was once shamed becomes the adult who shames. The humiliated nation becomes the conqueror. The abused mind becomes the abuser. Without transformation, pain becomes inheritance. But there is another layer to this, a psychological one. We derive identity from cruelty. It gives shape to our superiority, defines who we are by who we are not. The scapegoat mechanism, described by René Girard, explains this well. Societies maintain unity by projecting their chaos onto a chosen victim, a group, a class, a heretic, an outsider. By punishing the scapegoat, the group cleanses itself of its guilt. This ritual, ancient as time, still lives today. Every public outrage, every viral cancellation, every moral crusade follows the same logic. We destroy one so that the rest may feel pure. The unsettling truth is that cruelty feels good. Neuroscience has shown that acts of dominance and revenge activate the brain's reward centers, the same areas triggered by pleasure and addiction. When we witness someone we dislike being punished, we experience satisfaction. It is biological vindication, the primal self whispering, justice has been served. But what we call justice is often cruelty dressed in virtue. The brain doesn't care about morality, it cares about hierarchy. And this is where modern culture betrays itself. We condemn cruelty publicly, while feeding on it privately. We watch it in films, consume it in news cycles, reproduce it in gossip. We scroll through digital suffering as entertainment, safe behind our screens. The spectacle of pain keeps us engaged, righteous, superior. We've turned cruelty into currency, outrage as performance, empathy as theater, moral superiority as dopamine. Yet, the more we feed on cruelty, the emptier we become. Because beneath that momentary thrill lies decay, the quiet erosion of empathy, the dulling of conscience, the slow transformation of humans into spectators of suffering. When cruelty becomes normalized, compassion becomes naive. And when compassion becomes naive, cruelty wins. This is the terrifying genius of cruelty. It doesn't just destroy its victims, it corrupts its witnesses. Every time we look away, we become part of the mechanism. Every silence is a gear in the machine. You don't have to swing the sword to keep it sharp. You only have to do nothing. But perhaps the greatest cruelty is internal. The way we turn our own fear and failure into self-hatred. The mind that berates itself, punishes itself, denies itself love. That is cruelty turned inward. The world doesn't need to break us. We've learned to do it ourselves. The tyrant, the judge, the executioner, all live within. We punish ourselves for not being enough, for failing, for feeling, for existing. And just like the outer systems, our inner cruelty wears masks. Discipline, self-improvement, humility. We call it virtue, but it's violence. So where does this leave us? If cruelty is woven into our psychology, our systems, our biology, is there any way out? Can humanity evolve beyond it, or is it our eternal inheritance? That's the question we'll face next. Because in part 3, we will explore not the darkness of cruelty, but its transformation, how awareness can break its cycle, how empathy can survive in a world built on dominance, and how facing cruelty, not denying it, might be the first step toward true strength. Cruelty is not the opposite of compassion, it is its shadow. To destroy cruelty, we must not deny it, but bring it into light. For centuries, we've imagined goodness as the absence of evil, but that's a dangerous simplification. The person who denies their capacity for cruelty is the one most likely to become its instrument. True morality, true empathy begins not with purity, but with confrontation, the courage to look directly at the darkness within and say, yes, that too is me. Every human being carries two instincts, the will to harm and the will to heal. Civilization has always swung between these poles, disguising cruelty as justice and calling mercy weakness. But there are rare individuals, saints, philosophers, survivors, who learn to transform cruelty into awareness. They don't overcome their darkness by repression, they transmute it by recognition. They see cruelty not as something alien, but as a possibility always present, waiting to be mastered rather than indulged. Carl Jung called this process integrating the shadow. It is the realization that within every human heart lives the capacity for both tenderness and terror. When we repress the darker instinct, it grows stronger in the unconscious, where it acts without our permission. But when we acknowledge it, when we admit, yes, I am capable of cruelty, we take back the power to choose. Awareness becomes alchemy. The transformation begins in moments so small they almost go unnoticed. The instant before you lash out, when you feel the heat rise in your chest. The impulse to humiliate, to dominate, to make someone feel smaller, that is the shadow surfacing. But awareness interrupts it. You catch the cruelty as it's forming. You see it not as identity but as energy, ancient, raw, and personal. And in that moment, something changes. You choose not to act on it. You breathe. You let it burn without spreading. That act, though invisible to the world, is evolution. Because the truth is, cruelty will never vanish. It is woven into the structure of consciousness itself. What matters is not eradicating it, but transforming its energy. The same instinct that drives cruelty, the will to power, to exert one's force upon the world, is also the source of creation, courage, and love when refined. Fire can burn, but it can also forge. The choice lies in how we use it. Look at history's greatest transformations, those born not from moral preaching, but from confrontation with horror. The people who survived genocide and refused to become like their oppressors. The nations that faced their own atrocities and chose reconciliation over revenge. The individuals who suffered cruelty and turned it into compassion. That's not softness, that's transcendence. To endure pain without passing it on is the highest form of strength. But how do we cultivate that in a world that rewards cruelty, in a culture that thrives on outrage, mockery, and domination? The answer begins with awareness, a ruthless kind of honesty. We must see cruelty for what it is, everywhere it hides, in our institutions, in our humor, in our scrolling habits, in our private thoughts. Compassion is not blindness to cruelty, it's sight sharpened by understanding. It's the refusal to look away. Philosophers like Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi camps, understood this deeply. Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power and freedom. Cruelty collapses that space. It reacts instantly, instinctively. Awareness widens it. It turns reaction into reflection, vengeance into understanding. It allows the human being to become more than an animal acting on pain. And that may be the real instinct that separates us from beasts. Not reason, not language, but restraint. The ability to hold the impulse without surrendering to it. To feel the pull of cruelty and choose mercy instead. When we do this, even once, we rewrite the ancient pattern of violence encoded in our species. Each small act of compassion, especially when cruelty would be easier, is a quiet rebellion against millions of years of dominance and blood. Yet, this kind of awareness demands courage. Because to face cruelty, both in the world and within yourself, is to lose your innocence. You cannot unsee it once it's recognized. You start noticing how much of human interaction is built on subtle domination, how love can contain control, how kindness can hide pride, how generosity can serve ego. You begin to see how cruelty disguises itself as virtue. And that sight can be devastating. But it's also the first step toward awakening. Because awareness, unlike ignorance, does not need illusion to stay alive. It needs truth. There's a reason every spiritual tradition warns that awakening feels like death before it feels like freedom. When you dismantle your illusions, especially the illusion of your own goodness, something collapses. The false identity, the comforting story that you are purely virtuous, begins to dissolve. And what remains is terrifyingly real. A self that is both capable of harm and of healing, of cruelty and compassion, of destruction and creation. But only this whole self can love without violence, act without self-deception, and forgive without superiority. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." The chaos is our shadow, our cruelty, our rage, our will to power. The star is what emerges when we accept it, shape it, transform it. You cannot create light by denying darkness. You create it by integrating it. And perhaps that's what evolution truly means. Not the survival of the fittest, but the awakening of the most conscious. The species that learns not just to act, but to see. Not just to survive, but to transcend. We've evolved teeth and fire and machines, but our next evolution is inward, to master the instinct that made us both conquerors and destroyers. Cruelty will always tempt us because it is the easiest path to feeling powerful. But real power doesn't destroy, it understands. It transforms. When we can hold the awareness of cruelty without surrendering to it, we are no longer its victims or its perpetrators. We become something new, beings who can witness the darkness without becoming it. So as you move through the world, remember this. Every time you withhold cruelty, you participate in humanity's next evolution. Every moment you choose compassion over dominance, you shift the balance. Every truth you face, even when it hurts, weakens the ancient machinery of harm that lives within us all. And if this conversation has stirred something in you, that uneasy recognition of both light and dark within, stay with it. Don't look away. That discomfort is awareness being born. And awareness, when nurtured, becomes wisdom. If you want to keep exploring these inner thresholds, the hidden instincts, the paradoxes of mind and morality that shape our species, then stay here. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to a practice, the ongoing, uncomfortable, magnificent work of seeing clearly. Because cruelty may be ancient, but consciousness is its undoing. And the moment you begin to see, truly see, you've already begun to change.